Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress. Chapter 13, Sovereignty. Sovereignty. For only a moment, Ravses allowed herself the fullness of the sun's warmth on her pale alabaster skin. She had lowered her cloak all the way down to her waist, exposing her girdle, bliote and chemise, and she cinched up her sleeves to feel the sun warm her face, arms and hands, despite the winter cold that had recently settled on the lands. She squinted her red albino eyes and looked straight into the sun, while fidgeting with the ring of Tayafuan on her finger. Breathed deeply the cold air, then exhaled in a long, wispy, steamy breath that whipped across the side of her face in the wind. She sat on a small grey Canonian mule tethered to Piecora's larger tan and black stallion before her, and Otto seated behind her. Valesh sat next to them on her own horse, a small muscular quarter horse dappled in grey and white. In front of them, next to Piecora, sat Eindon on his large black mare. All of them wore packs for travelling with enough food for 2 months, not counting Piecora's hunting prowess, and each horse carried enough supplies to last them several cross-country trips around Cannoneer. About 2 meters of snow blanketed the rural landscape surrounding them, and a biting breeze passed through Ravses's ears, stinging their long, pointed tips. Her albino white hair blew freely in the wind as Artur leaned heavily against her back with his arms around her torso. She wondered if he slept. To the north stretched lightly forested foothills that eventually rose up into the mangy mountains of Erith Amron. To the east lay the city of Alagost, now barely visible in the crisp, clear winter distance. The Silver Gallop Road lay to the south, although she could not see it, for it was obscured by the snowy hills and loose thickets of trees and brush over the open snow-covered scrubland. Beyond the road, further south, she knew were the dreadful sleepless hills, of which she had only heard tales. Finally, to the west, lay open hills with the occasional old oak tree, or small grove of trees for as far as the eye could see, until it reached a dark tree line on the horizon. They had emerged from Callistico Mansion, the home of the Harp and Wave, far beneath the city of Alagost, a little less than a week ago from an abandoned mine entrance outside the city. They made their way west from there to where they now stood on this clear mid-morning in the wilderness of Dermoda, the realm of the cities Alagost and Thessol Dargad. There were no farms, no villages, nothing implying civilized life here other than the 4 of them. There was only the snow, the hills, the occasional old oak tree, and whatever creatures scurried beneath the snow or birds in the air trying to find them. One such bird was Hero, Piecora's soul-bonded falcon, now circling above them in the cerulean sky. He rejoined them the same day they left Eindon's subterranean lair, as if he was waiting for them, and Piecora erupted with joy and renewed purpose. Ravsesa recalled how jubilant they all were to see the sky again and feel the winter air. Piecora grabbed Artur, ran to where the snow was deepest near the side of a rising hill, and mockingly wrestled with him in the snow. Valesh came to his aid, and together they vanquished the Sienjan giant by burying her in the snow and placing a stick between her antlers to mark the monster's grave as a warning to other adventurers not to meddle with such legendary heroes as Valesh and Artur. Moments later, Piecora burst from the snow to chase the children, and smartly they ran in opposing directions, forcing her to give up the pursuit. Ravses laughed with a full throat and open mouth, as if her heart were completely emptying its contents into the air. She couldn't remember ever laughing like that, even as a child, and she would never forget it for as long as she lived. As Ravses recalled these memories and luxuriated in this moment, Eindon turned his horse to the side and pointed toward the mountains in the northwest. Just beyond that initial ridge is our destination. There is a pass that leads over the ridge that is gentle to the horses. We've made this trip many times, he said, patting his own horse and referencing the others. He had provided them with everything, including the horses that were maintained and cared for, just inside the abandoned mine, by his servants. The mine had been reconfigured into a sprawling stable of horses, goats, pigs, chickens, and other animals. Passageways from the underground mansion led into the mine from several connections. "What awaits us there?" asked Ravsez. "You'll see," said Eindon, smiling. Then he rode off toward the mountains, sending his mare into a full gallop over the flat, unblemished snow. Piecora followed, but at a pace that allowed Ravsez's mule and Valesh's pony to keep up. 3 days later, they sat on their horses within a snow-trampled pass over the lower extremity of the Ereth Amran mountain range, looking below them on the northern side. There, in the lowlands before them, Ravsez beheld a large encampment with many tents and cook fires, too many to count. Evening approached, and the sun began setting in the west behind them, leaving them in shadow and darkening the village beneath them. It was impossible for her to believe, but in the midst of the camp was a gigantic, triple-masted ship, rivaling even the largest Muthan oceanic galleon. It was larger than the Wellenbrecher, the ship that carried her and her son across the salt sea more than a month ago. The ship before her wasn't a wrecked ship, though, as it did not lean on its side the way ships on dry land do. It stood straight and unmoving. Squinting her eyes, she saw many people climbing over the ship, boarding it and leaving it, and a constant commotion of calls, yells, and orders being barked over the ship echoed across the encampment. Eindon turned to his travel companions and said with a flourish of his hand, "Welcome to the Sovereignty. We may be just in time for dinner." As they descended the wide pass into the lowlands, Eindon explained the story of the Sovereignty to them. "Many years ago, I had an idea of how to get across the wildlands safely to Ediotor. The organisation I belong to, Quiacudius Untai Nanua, or those who watch the door, watches all portals, thresholds, crossways, ley lines, and any temporal fractures or weaknesses between our world, the primal realm, and other worlds. We are stewards and protectors of this world, and guard it against entities that threaten it, and we do this in the shadows, without anyone's knowledge. For most people simply cannot properly handle this kind of information, nor can they ever know who and what we really are. We've been meaning to post someone at Ediotor for a long time, but as you know, the wildlands present a bit of a pickle. The lands are always moving, and Ediotor with them. It is difficult and dangerous even for us to travel the wildlands without a proper guide. We know very little about the ancient fortress that is claimed to be haunted by madness, and I've made it my mission to change that. When I was sent to Canoniah to investigate the Domosithrai Entia Flus Thumai, home of the harp and the wave that belonged to the Callistico family, and realised what they were digging for beneath the mansion, I saw an opportunity, he said as he turned in the saddle to catch their responses. He held their interested gazes a moment before continuing conspiratorially. I thought, if Ediotor was built from a coalition between Canoniah and Sienja, and served as a symbol and beacon of their alliance, why not do this in the same spirit? Why not build a great vessel, capable of traversing over land, sea, and yes, even air, built by the greatest minds and hands of Muth, Brenz, Canoniah, Helicles, and even the Thrundran dwarves? It was finally completed the day I met you, and the night I became appallingly drunk from celebrating. I knew I would require many days to recover from that, and you chose to awaken me in the middle of my slumber. Ha! But now we know it was for the best, for again I see an opportunity. This is the way to get Ravsez and her son to Ciudanath safely, and the Sovereignty could use another guide. Another? Asked Piecora dubiously. Eindon turned and nodded his head. Yes, graduated top honours from the Dolgithaden Temple Library with a special interest in the wildlands, flora and fauna, weather, water quality. You can't shut him up once he gets talking. His passion shines right through. Has he even been to the wildlands? Asked Piecora. Nay, this will serve as his thesis. Did I mention he is the youngest of the 3 sons of King Therin and Queen Lendis Rineville of Dolgithad? They've made him a master librarian already. You have a Dolgithadan prince going on this expedition? Are you mad? Cried Piecora in shock. Wasn't my call, said Einden dismissively. Once they learned of the project, the king and queen demanded that Tharil Rineville go along as part of the funding. Funding? Asked Piecora with exasperation. You sit on all of Callistico's wealth. Why do you need funding? Valesh, how much of your money would you like me to spend? Especially if there are other options. Ah, I thought that would be your answer, Einden said, answering his own query mockingly. Valesh was dumbfounded as she watched the conversation unfold between Piecora and Einden. So now you see how good it was that we met, said Einden. Piecora, he is a good lad, and he knows much that he's been taught and that he learned in school. He then turned and pointed a finger at Piecora. You are to keep him alive. Understood? Piecora stared back at him incensed, but said nothing. How is it possible that a ship, began Ravsis, but Einden cut her off. Ah, that is the question, isn't it? He answered. It is glorious to behold. Years of combined research and engineering from the most brilliant minds of Urm's wealthiest countries have led us to this moment. The sovereignty is something new and unique in this world, young Ravses. No one has ever seen anything like it before, not ever. It is better to just see it up close. I cannot do it justice with my mere words. But if you wish to learn how it all works, there are those down there who can explain it to you. Specifically, ask Wilhelmina Weisskramor. She knows the ship inside and out. We'd be lost without her, but don't tell her I said that. It's better if she remains humble. The party fell silent as they rode the rest of the way down the path and into the camp as the sun sank behind the mountains behind them. Oil lamps flickered all around, and the smell of bacon and bread filled the air, making Ravses's mouth water. Beneath the magnificent presence of the sovereignty, cheers went up at the sight of Eindon from those who weren't busy with their duties. Ravsese looked around in wonder at this thriving community that Eindon had created with common purpose, and wondered if this was similar to how Ciudanath got started, the town that lay between Ediator and Cienja. She desperately wanted to speak to Piecora in private and ask her a myriad of questions, including how comfortable she was with all of this. But there was no chance of that right now. They rode slowly through a wide avenue lined with tents, huts and shacks with signs hanging from gutters or stuck on posts that read leatherworks, embroidery, chickens and sundries, wood carving, palms and prophecies, and many other establishments. Finally, a man approached Einden and took his horse's reins. "My lord, glad to see you well," said the man in a thick Havener accent. He was tall, bald, and somewhere in the late middling of his adult years. A full dark moustache grew on his face that covered his upper lip. To Ravses, he seemed to be made from the rugged life of a farmer, and yet held himself straight as a lord. She wondered if he had a family, and if so, if they were here with him, or if they weren't, whether they knew of his current whereabouts and mission. "Grig, my dear friend, always good to see you," said Einden. "Everything seems to be running smoothly and efficiently beneath your purview, as always." "Aye, we manage, that we do. Now that we be at the end of it all, many of us be wondering about what's next. Sides seeing the machine we been building for these last few years leaving us behind in a wake. Won't be any dry eyes on that day, mark me words," said the man. Eindon gestured toward Valesh behind him and said, "Grigorial Mitraculatos, meet Valesh Callistico, my new representative. She and I will work closely with everyone when the sovereignty lifts and sails into the wildlands, which includes payment and further employment, either for me or through my many connections. Fear not, Grig, my boy. Everyone will be compensated richly now that we find ourselves at the conclusion of this memorious and momentous endeavour. Books will be written about you all, and schools will study what we accomplished here. not just in Canonia, but everywhere. "Thank ye, my lord, the people will be glad to hear that," said Grigg. "Shall I find you rooms? I think there be some free at the Hop and Weasel." "Not that kind of energy, lad," said Eindon, as he dismounted from his horse. He then stepped closer to Grigg and said, "We set sail in 3 days. Is that right? Are we still on schedule?" "That we are, my lord," said Grigg, looking down at the wealthy sponsor of this enormous project. Ravsés was still staring around her while trying to grasp it all with her mind and listening to their conversation. She just couldn't believe any of it was real. Eindon waved his hand at Ravsés and Orta and said, "Ravsés, you and your son, come over here, please." Piecora hopped down from her stallion and then helped Ravsés and Artur from their mule. The ground beneath Ravsés's soft boots was hard, brittle, and beginning to freeze again now that the sun had left the sky. Piecora took her by the hand, and Ravsés held Artur's hand, and together they approached Eindon and Grigg. Eindon put his arm around Ravsés and said quietly to Grigg, "I have 2 delicate guests that are going on the ship, Grigg. They are not to be handled or trifled with, as they desire their privacy, and I am personally responsible for them. Their destination is Keodaneth, like our own, and that's why they're coming along. Same with the Xianjian here. This is Piecora, the Xianjian guide. Perhaps you've heard of her." Grigg looked at Piecora and nodded politely. "I have, yes. I've heard of the Xianjian guide. It comforts me that she is going too." "It should comfort all of us, especially Prince Tharil," said Eindon. "These 2, this is Ravsés and her son, Artur. They are Piecora's charge. Piecora is tasked with getting them through the wildlands to Keodaneth, and now she has another task, keeping young Tharil alive. This should put all of us at ease, wouldn't you agree? I know his last-minute involvement was a source of concern for all of us." "Yes, my lord," said Grigg. Ravsés couldn't put a finger on it, but despite the pleasantries and calmness of their conversation, there was something tense about the 2 men, like an underlying nervousness that both of them could identify but not speak about. "Here's what I'd like you to do, Grigg," said Eindon diplomatically. "I'd like Ravsés and her son to stay on the ship now, in one of the passenger quarters separate from the crew as esteemed guests. Put them in their own room, set aside from the others. I don't want anyone bothering them. I'll let you manage all of that, but do it tonight so everything's sorted. Can you do this for me?" "Of course, my lord," said Grigg. "What about Piecora?" "She comes and goes as she likes. We will need her to have as much freedom as she needs. Make sure the crew understands her authority." "Very well, my lord," said Grigg. "Piecora, where would you like to stay before we leave? We have several options, depending on your tastes." "In the ship, with them," said Piecora. Grigg nodded and said, "Well then, let's get ye out of this cold and serve you some supper." That would be the last time Ravsés ever saw of Grigoriel Mitrakulatos. Ravsés sat on a large double bed that she and Piecora moved against the wooden wall beneath a circular window with no glass or covering except for 2 linen curtains that blew lazily in the night breeze. It was a small window, but large enough for someone to fit through in case of emergency. Piecora wasn't taking any chances. The large room was richly appointed with several rugs, comfortable chairs, and wooden table bolted down into the floorboards. In the corner at the base of the bed stood a Mutton-engineered wood stove that Ravsés recognised as one of the more efficient designs, requiring only 1 log of wood to heat the room for a single evening, so that the inhabitants could sleep soundly without having to constantly tend the fire. A large wardrobe for clothes dominated another wall, along with a writing desk and a shelf of books. In the back of the room, opposite the single door, was a marble bath with plumbing that allowed for hot water. It was a lord's room, Ravsés thought, fit for Eindon himself. But apparently it was explained to them that all of the passenger rooms were like this on the level just below the top deck of the ship. Another level beneath them had double the rooms for half the luxury, and beneath that level were the crew's quarters, with the exception of the captain, who had his room in the same upper deck as the one appointed to Ravzi's. They met the captain earlier that night when they ate dinner at Muffin Honey, a place named after its owner and cook. Muffin, or Daphne Mulankai, which was her real name, used to work for Ashavai the Heroless in Alagost, and eventually gained employment at the Bishop's Lament. Known for her cooking, she caught the eye of Einden, and he asked her to come work on the sovereignty. That was 4 years ago, almost to the day, and in that time she married and bore 3 children who are growing up in the little makeshift towns surrounding the gigantic sovereignty. Her husband, Ioannis Mulankai, was one of the elder carpenters. Ravsese wondered what kind of life the family might find now that the sovereignty was completed. Oiom Vidal, the captain, filled the crew of the sovereignty with those who sailed his ship, the Nagging Nettle, before it was impounded for overdue taxes by the Coast Haven Guard, called the League of the Gull. Eindon promised Ogiom both the return of his ship as well as a clean financial slate once they returned from the wildlands with the sovereignty. "You're a Sienjan," said Piecora, after he sat down with them at their table. "Ogiom Vidal, that's a Sienjan name, and you speak like a Sienjan. What is a Sienjan doing on the open seas as a ship captain of all things? Sienjans hate the sea." "I am Sienjan by birth, but I am not from Sienja, nor have I ever seen Sienja, my sister, in Stag," said Ogiom. "I was born in the enclave called Bear's Watch, or Mirdreth Oliom Dami Espea in our tongue, or Bear Watches over the sea in Low Canonian, and Ursus Custodit Mara in High Canonian. It's a small community that overlooks the Salt Sea and Julian Bay from a high bluff south of Enigrad, near the beaches. As to how I came to become a captain, it is just the path that was set before me as I stepped through my life with no real ambitions. I found work along the docks in Coast Haven, and like many, that led to work on a ship. But unlike many of us Sienjans, I grew to love the sea, and when I returned home, I would stare out across the waves from Bear's Watch and yearn to feel the movement of the sea beneath my feet again. I know that is very un-Sienjan, but maybe that is the Canonian part of me. I hope you do not see me as less." Ravsesi observed a relaxed serenity within Ogiom despite his impressive size. He was a large, muscular man, with hair bristling all over his wide shoulders and arms, almost like fur. His dark brown beard looked as if it grew naturally from his cheekbones over weeks in the salty winds of the sea, and his long, unkempt brown hair was clasped by an ivory ring. He had dark brown, sorrowful eyes that seemed weary of the world. "So, you are one of the mixed Sienjan Canonians I meet so often in Enigrad?" asked Piecora. "Do you follow the Sienjan totems, or the Canonian gods?" "I follow Bear, like my family," he said, "hence the name of our enclave. We all follow in the peace, wisdom, and vigilance of Bear." His deep voice was soothing and melodic. It reminded her of a large animal purring in contentment. "I could have guessed you followed Bear even without knowing the name of your family," said Piecora, laughing, her eyes beaming. "It is written on your face and your demeanour. Like the people of Enigrad in these lands, I know you are 2 people. One is calm, gentle, peaceful and kind, seeking only to heal the hurts of others, but the other is ferocious and rapaciously violent, a predator who slays until they are slain when driven to rage. The time that exists between the two is less than the snap of a finger, and often as unpredictable." Ogiom looked up at her with his dark, heavy eyes, nodded and said, "True." Ravses felt like a spectator as the two got along well that night, each finding the other interesting and relatable with their unique associations with Sienja. Whereas Ogiom was of Sienjan blood but born and raised in Canonia, Piecora was born in Sienja but was then ostracized when she returned with Hero and tried to explain the discovery and nature of their soul bond to her kinsman. She tried to tell them that all Xianjuns only have half of their soul, and the other half resided within an animal local to Xianjia, and they only need to find it to feel whole. They laughed at her, mocked her, and physically beat her until she fled Xianjia and found solace in the wildlands. Piecora thought it was the hold of the hermit that caused the people to respond in this way, as she considered the hermit to be the source of the splitting of Xianjun souls from the time of their births, to make them easier for him to control. Any Xianjun who discovered their soul bond was deemed a threat to the hermit, also named Tukurai among Xianjuns. And because Xianjuns so loved Tukurai as their oracle and spiritual leader, any threat to Tukurai was a threat to Xianjia, so they would not listen to her or anyone else who tried to convince them. Piecora was lucky to survive and escape. When Piecora briefly touched on this, Urm opened his eyes wide and said, "I have heard of the likes of those who form a union with the animals of Xianjia, discovering their united souls together. It is like the same person but living in two vessels, one animal and one person. Do I have that right? We have old texts of this in our enclave. These are like myths to us, just folk tales. But you say this is true? You say you are one of these? I must see this with my own eyes." "Oh, you shall, my friend," said Piecora, laughing. "Hero and I are bonded like this." And she hooked two fingers together. "You will see how beautiful it is. Hero is my eyes and ears in the sky. He allows me to see everything, and sometimes I can even speak through him." Ravsese could see the raw catharsis filling Piecora from finally meeting someone of her own kin, who listened to her story with genuine interest and amazement. Then Ravsese felt a sudden, unexpected pang of shame within her, as if she were intruding on two people, connecting in ways that made her feel imposing, disposable, even voyeuristic. It made her think of Alice's story of meeting Vinexi. She became embarrassed and quickly swept these ridiculous thoughts from her mind, knowing in her heart that it was good to see Piecora happy for once. She reminded herself that it was in her and Orta's best interest to see Piecora got along well with the captain of the sovereignty. It would be good for everyone that the two of them were aligned, she thought to herself. Ravsese pulled a blanket over her shoulders as she stared out the window from her seated position, on the bed at the remaining sliver of the white moon high in the night sky. She heard Piecora place a single log into the stove behind her and shut the iron lid. "So only one log will heat this room for the entire night?" asked Piecora. "Hard for me to believe." "It is hard for me to believe that we can find such extravagance here in this ship of the land," said Ravsese absently. Aotor sat on the floor next to the bed, playing with his new rat-catcher toy that Eindon's servants made for him. It all began to run together for Ravsese, and she felt exhaustion overtake her that she feared was more than physical fatigue, and that it would remain no matter how much sleep she might have tonight. "What is wrong?" asked Piecora quietly as she sat on the bed next to Ravsese. Somehow the room felt more vacant without Valesh being with them, playing with her son. Somewhere out there in the night, Ravsese knew the Callistico girl now belonged to Eindon's world, and she hoped that Valesh was all right. "I feel very disjointed, separated from my body, as if I'm merely spectating my whole life passing by without any control of my own. It seems like forever ago when Artur and I stepped off the Wellenbrecker, and now we're here and I can hardly even understand where here is. It's all so unexpected. I thought just the three of us, you, me and Artur, we would ride off into the wildlands and just make our way on our own. I know I should feel safer now with all of this. All of these people, this ship, this extraordinary invention. But somehow I feel more uncertain, more afraid than ever." Piecora began massaging Ravsese's shoulders and neck tenderly, yet with great strength, and although Ravsese felt herself succumb to a more relaxed state, still an unidentifiable fear lingered in her mind and heart. "Ravsese," Piecora said, "I will not let anything happen to you or Artur. You are more than my charge now. You are like family to me." "How do you feel about this expedition?" asked Ravsesi. She felt Piecora snort through her nose and shrug her shoulders. "We came to Alagost to beg Eindon for money to buy supplies. A couple wagons, a few sellswords, food and water. I thought I would have to put together an expedition of my own, something I was never entirely comfortable with because I usually just go alone with my client, or I'm attached to a caravan that's already gathered and paid for. But then we got this, all of this, and this is beyond anything I could ever imagine. In many ways we are extremely lucky to be a part of this. I think it will be much better and easier for you and Ortor to have so many people around as we travel through the wildlands. But if you are asking for my private thoughts, I will tell you that I think it is all doomed, and we need to stay close together, ready to leave at any moment." Ravses turned to face Piecora and whispered quietly, "Why don't we just leave now? We are right here on Canonia's western border. The ship leaves in 3 days. Why not just take what we need and leave tonight?" Piecora stared at her for a long moment before saying, "I would, and in my heart I want to. But I know the wildlands, and you must trust me that it is better to be here, on this ship and with these people. But do not endear yourself to anyone too deeply. We must be ready and able to leave at any moment. I do not trust anyone here, nor do I place any faith in this ridiculous invention." "You seem to have the captain's trust," said Ravses, suddenly aghast at what she heard herself say and the tone in which she said it. She wished she could pull the words back into her mouth, but before she could think of how to cover up any perceptible sign of affection or jealousy she may have accidentally revealed, Piecora placed her hand to the side of Ravses's face, caressed it gently with her thumb, and then pressed her own cheek to hers. Ravses felt her pulse rise rapidly by the warm contact of their faces together, and the smell of the Sienjan's thick black braids. After a moment, Piecora said quietly in Ravses's ear, "That is nothing, Ravsese. That is not my heart. Just 2 Sienjans bantering together, joyful to have found their kindred. Please try to understand who we are. Sienjans are free with our affections toward each other, just as we are with our anger. It is playful and joyful, but nothing more. I do not mean to stir such resentment in you. Can you allow me to be who I am, while knowing where my heart truly lies?" Piecora pulled back, but she remained close and looked deeply into Ravsesi's pink eyes, and whispered, "When it all goes to Shiendi, when the wildlands swallow up this contraption and the crew is lost, it will be you, me and Ortor together. We will survive, and we will find Keodaneth, because my heart lies right here, between us. This is what matters to me, not some Sienjan frivolity. Can you allow that? For me?" Ravsesi couldn't breathe, nor could she formulate any of the maddening thoughts racing through her mind, so captivated she was by the profound presence of Piecora's sincerity that seemed to envelope them both inside a soundproof cocoon of intimacy. To be so close with Piecora now as the beneficiary of her heart filled Ravsese with brand new emotions that she never knew she felt for the Sienjan. She cared deeply for Piecora, her guide and protector, and trusted both her own life and her son's within Piecora's care. But suddenly tonight, everything changed into something intimately deeper and closer, and with it came the heavy, complicated weight of meaning and commitment. Overlaying this was something Ravsesi felt for the first time in her life, a palpable, agonizing fear of losing someone beyond Ortor, and this person was right in front of her, within a breath's distance. The initial realization of this was almost too much for her to bear. Whatever this was, it was powerful and consuming, completely arresting her heart, and she knew there was no going back to how things were, even if she tried. Briefly, she looked away from Piecora's smouldering ebony eyes, and down at Artur, who she knew was listening to their every word. But then Piecora leaned forward and kissed Ravses slowly, quietly, and tenderly on the lips, and Ravsesi abandoned herself to the reconfigured destinies the fates had decided for them both tonight. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.